This is episode 369 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and get discounts on all the items in our shop, along with access to special bonus history content for every episode. Learn more at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lemon, professor of English at the University of Southern California and author of Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
So if Elizabeth had accepted his proposal, she would have been basically acknowledging she was illegitimate because the premise of her parents' marriage would have been thrown out.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Elizabeth I is perhaps the most famous Queen of England, reigning from November 1558 until her death in 1603. When you study her life, you quickly learn that she was known as the Virgin Queen for her staunch stance against marriage. Despite directives from her court and intense peer pressure from those around her, Elizabeth faced down scandal, rumors, and suspicions throughout her reign, only to remain stalwart in her commitment to not only never marry, but to never be known as someone whose virginity was taken from her. Given that the royal lineage is so important, not only in England, but in most monarchal governments, and that literal wars have been fought over the rightful heir to the throne, it's definitely a challenge to the status quo that Elizabeth not only did not produce an heir, but intentionally chose not to do so. Here this week to help us explore what this stance was like for the people of England in Shakespeare's lifetime, and why it was so important to Elizabeth that she risked so greatly to maintain her choice, as well as what happened at her death that prevented a war from rising up with the lack of an heir, is our guest, British historian and professional history podcaster, Ann LLoyd. Ann LLoyd is a British historian, speaker, and author who specializes in Shakespeare, 16th century England, women's lives in particular, and leadership. She is a professional speaker with Smithsonian Journeys, Agecroft Hall, Royal Oak Foundation, and more. She has special experience in the early modern period and Shakespeare, and was the first manager of visitor education at Folger Shakespeare Library. Ann is the host of Royal Rebels and Romantics, the history podcast, and author of The Tudors by the Numbers, Counting the Virgin Queen, How to Build Relationships One Conversation at a Time, and Meaningful Conversations. Find out more about Ann, along with links to her books and her podcast, in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into the conversation today, I want to remind you that there's coordinating visual history content about our conversation today. It's information on Elizabeth I, including portraits, primary documents, and museum artifacts. And all of these extras are available for patrons of our show. Access the extras this week at CassidyCash.com/episode 369 and click on detailed show notes to see all of the extras while you listen to the podcast. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Ann. I am delighted to welcome you to That Shakespeare Life. For years now, we've been following each other's work. I think we've talked online and even met up at conferences. So it's just a pleasure to finally have you here to be a guest on our show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Cassidy. I am so excited to be here. I love your work and all that you do, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
Let's dive in here with explaining why was it so important to Elizabeth that she be seen as a virgin? What is the cultural symbolism of that image in particular?
Well, it's really interesting because at the beginning of her life, Elizabeth became a potential marriage partner. And so even as a young woman, it was very important. Her virginity, her body, and her protection of her body was in a way part of her capital and her power. So early on, while she was living with Catherine Parr, and then Thomas Seymour married Catherine Parr and moved in, there were some questions about what happened between Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour, and Catherine Parr counseled her on that. We know that because of a letter Elizabeth wrote to Catherine Parr that we have. And she acknowledges that her reputation is very important, and she understands that. So from the time she was a young teenager, Elizabeth knew that her virginity was part of her power. She could control that and would have to use all of her wits and all of her abilities to control her reputation surrounding her virginity. That was true throughout her reign. And early on, she was a young queen, obviously a virgin, a marriage prospect. As time went on, and she became, we would never call Queen Elizabeth old, of course, but as her reign went on and the prospects sort of were fewer and further between, she morphed into this virgin image, which she very carefully cultivated with the use of pearls, as she had 2 portraits commissioned holding a sieve, which reached back to Petrarch's work on the virgin maidens who were so pure that they could carry water in a sieve, and their purity kept the water in the sieve and no little droplets came out. So Elizabeth cultivated that idea of a virgin queen for herself throughout her life and throughout her reign. It was very important to her that she be seen as untouched and unviolated.
Even when we don't know much about royal life, most people will be familiar with how important it is within any royal family to continue the family line. I think of, as a modern reference, in my own lifetime, when Princess Diana had William and Harry, they were known as the heir and the spare. But even in Susie Edge's video presentations on Instagram, where she walks through a royal genealogy, she always follows up a major disaster with this phrase of, but it's okay because he had a son. And we laugh, but it's a long-standing expectation that having a child as a monarch was this specific way to preserve the monarchy itself. Given Elizabeth I's sense of duty, her strong sense of duty and commitment to the country, why was that not a minimum expectation that she had of herself, I wonder? And how could she have been revered by the populace for being a virgin instead of being ridiculed for not providing an heir?
Well, there were certainly many people who questioned that decision, and she was very careful in the beginning of her reign, in those early years where she could have married and had children, to both say, I will never marry, and say, well, of course I will marry. So she sort of played both sides. But one thing that's really interesting in what you said is the idea that it's okay because he has a son. A king's status is strengthened with a son. A queen's status is different. There was such a preference for the male monarch. Monarchy is male. That was the assumption. That's what everybody took as the truth, as given. And so when Mary I and then Elizabeth I, 2 women in a row, that's never happened before or since, 2 women in a row, it was disconcerting to people. And in fact, Elizabeth had a front row seat to what happened to Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a baby son, and her lords forced her to abdicate in favor of her baby son. Now, there were lots of things they had against Mary, Queen of Scots, but the fact that she had a son, a preferred male monarch, to take over for her, even as an infant, demonstrated, I think, one of the things Elizabeth was very aware of. Any son she had might weaken her hold on the throne. So for herself, she was aware of that. The other thing was that had she, let's say she had a son and that son didn't pose a threat. Even so, if she were married to an Englishman, if she married somebody from England, by definition, he would not have been royal because she was the acknowledged royal. So it would have been the child of Elizabeth, whose right to the throne was questioned by Catholics, and a commoner. That child would probably have been challenged for his status, even as a male, to the throne. That could have caused a lot of problems. had Elizabeth married a foreign royal, as her sister did, that child would have been seen as an outsider and again could have been challenged. So there was no easy, clear path for a regnant queen to marry and produce an heir. And Elizabeth was very aware of all those complications and the danger to herself and potentially to her child when that child was the heir and possibly becoming the next king or queen, that the parentage of a questionable, Catholics didn't believe Elizabeth should be on the throne, and either a foreigner or a commoner, that would have created a problem, very likely for that child as well.
Well, we've outlined some pretty solid evidence for what her motivations might have been, but I want to ask about whether there's any evidence of a physical injury or perhaps disease that might have meant Elizabeth was infertile and she might have been unable to have children. Could she have been motivated to paint this virgin queen image for herself as a way to prevent being seen as a failure?
We don't know. We have a few reports of examinations of Elizabeth when she is an infant and there is a chance of a French marriage. This little baby girl is displayed, and the description is she is displayed quite naked before the French ambassadors, but she's a baby and they're not doctors. So of course, that really means nothing except there's nothing visible. Throughout her life, Elizabeth's own doctors made statements about her health, about her ability to bear children, which doctors absolutely testified to during Elizabeth's lifetime. However, of course, they worked for her. And so that was the message she wanted out there. So do we know for sure that they were being accurate? No, we don't know. There is no evidence that the smallpox had done anything other than scar her. It's pretty much accepted that she got scars from the smallpox, but that is not associated regularly with infertility. And so that one illness we definitely know about isn't likely to have caused infertility. And we don't know any other thing that might have. There's no evidence. Now, there were plenty of rumors. There were rumors she was unable to have sex. There were rumors she was unable to get pregnant. There were just as many rumors, often by the same people, that she had a boatload of illegitimate children scattered throughout the country. So that idea of her sexuality was, as is so common, a target for any of her enemies to attack her, either that she was not a natural woman able to bear children, or that she was not a natural woman because she bore so many children out of wedlock. So we have lots of rumors about that, but nothing to back them up.
I mean, this is a real Southern reaction here, but bless her heart, because she had, with the parents that she had coming into this, it was a tough go from the beginning in terms of combating those rumors. But tell us about what measures were taken at court. I mean, I have to think that the powers that be surrounding her there would want to encourage or even try to convince Elizabeth to get married when she was during, childbearing years. Do we know who the potential suitors were that were put forward as like, hey, you could marry this guy?
Yes. So we do have from her very first parliament, both the Lords and the Commons petitioned her to marry and have an heir and do so quickly. So right from the start, that was the focus. In fact, one of the first letters we have, and it's from the Spanish ambassador who's writing to Philip of Spain, and he's pretty candid with Philip. This is the Count of Feria, and he and Philip have a very candid relationship, and it's a great correspondence. And you really get to see what they're thinking and what their opinions are. And what de Feria said right after Elizabeth becomes queen is that the main thing, the big question everybody's wondering on, everything depends. That's his words. Everything depends upon the husband this woman may take. So everyone was waiting to see what husband this woman would take. Now, Philip of Spain was one of her earliest suitors. This is the man who had been married to her half-sister Mary. When Mary died, Philip is now single again. He liked being king of England. He was in the process of returning England to Catholicism. That process had not been totally complete. He did not want to see England sway back into the Reform faith. So, although he says to his friend de Feria that he's not really excited about it, he puts himself forth as a suitor. So, one of her earliest suitors is her brother-in-law, which is ironic in many, many ways, including her parents' marriage is based on the belief that you cannot marry your dead sibling's spouse. Henry VIII could not marry Arthur's wife, Catherine of Aragon. That's what Henry VIII used to marry Anne Boleyn. So what Philip was suggesting is exactly that. So if Elizabeth had accepted his proposal, she would have been basically acknowledging she was illegitimate because the premise of her parents' marriage would have been thrown out. So she mentioned that. And the response from de Feria was, oh, we'll just get a dispensation from the Pope. Well, that was a problem. So Elizabeth did not marry him. She also chose not to marry the King of Sweden. He was another early suitor. He had actually approached her during Mary I's reign. So even before she became queen, he approached her again after she became queen. His sort of play for her hand was that he and Sweden were Protestant. There weren't a lot of international options who were not Catholic. And marrying a Catholic would be problematic if Elizabeth wanted to maintain, and I use the word Protestant. It does not mean at all the same thing that it means today. There were many variations. It was really the Reformed faith or not the Catholic faith. But Eric of Sweden was one of the very, very few royals who might not pressure Elizabeth to change her religion. But Sweden really offered nothing in terms of monetary support or military support or any of the things a foreign alliance should give England. And so he was turned down. There were other foreign suitors. The Archduke Charles of Austria actually was a long-term suitor. He was considered for a while and then not, and then considered again, depending on how the politics of the world was going at the time. But of course, one of the longest and he felt the most likely suitors is Elizabeth's BFF, Robert Dudley, who becomes Earl of Leicester. And he really believed that he could eventually win her hand. He did not, but he was a player sort of throughout her whole reign and got in the way of any other suits working.
I love that story of the two of them. I was convinced that he could give it a go. You read through, he came the closest, I would think, of anyone.
Yeah.
Even Elizabeth isn't immortal. And when she did eventually die, someone had to be named monarch in her place. Without any children, Elizabeth selected James I of Scotland, or who would become James I of Scotland. Do we know what the process was for selecting James? Why did she pick him?
So there's a lot of controversy and a lot of new research about her feelings, exactly what her feelings were. For quite a while, it was thought that someone had said his name and she brought her hands to her head like it was a crown. Now there's a lot of questions about whether or not that really happened. Basically, Elizabeth had dangled the possibility of naming Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir. If you looked just at the traditional way that heirs were chosen, Elizabeth was the final heir of Henry VIII, and the next place to turn is Henry VIII's elder sister, Margaret, and that brings us to Mary, Queen of Scots. So Elizabeth, in that notion, was following sort of the traditional path, and she sort of dangled in front of Mary, Queen of Scots, I'll name you as my heir if you stop claiming my throne, because Mary, Queen of Scots was claiming to be Queen of England. The two women never got together. I don't know if Elizabeth really meant it. Mary said, I will stop claiming your throne if you name me heir. They're both saying you go first, and it never came to that. But Elizabeth, if you believe her, considered Mary to be her heir, and it would make sense she would consider Mary's son, who became James VI of Scotland, to be her heir after Mary was executed. We know that Elizabeth's ministers and Elizabeth worked hard to keep a good relationship with James, particularly after the awkward moment when Elizabeth signed the death warrant and Mary, Queen of Scots, his mother, was beheaded. So they worked really
that puts
hard.
a damper on anyone's relationship, I would think. Yeah.
An issue, an awkward moment. But I think James had his eye on the English throne and he played along. He chose to accept Elizabeth's explanation, which was, I did sign the execution warrant, but I never intended for it to be carried out. Okay. He chose to believe that. And the relationship between Elizabeth and James, and particularly between her ministers and James, continued to grow stronger. The other real option at that point was Arbella Stuart, another descendant of Margaret Tudor. Arbella's, sort of a good option there. One of the reasons Arbella was strongly considered was that she was born in England and considered an English woman, whereas James was born in Scotland and was King of Scotland and had lived his whole life in Scotland and was a foreigner. But as time went on, it became clear that the ministers, particularly Robert Cecil, were really pushing for a relationship with James and the continuation of what we loosely call the Protestant. It was different in Scotland than in England, but it would keep that religion, that reform religion, going on in England. And that was sort of a cumulative. It was many people working toward that. And actually, the succession went very smoothly. James had done a lot of reaching out and a lot of politicking, we might say, to really bring that quite smoothly into fact. And there was not a disruption or any real rebellions or anything like that when James came to the throne as James I of England.
As I recall, and correct me here if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but relations with Scotland were kind of sketchy during this time period. I know there were border skirmishes between Scotland and England during this time, and I'm always surprised that she picked James I, and I'm sure many in England were just as surprised. Do we know what the response was from the people to James I in terms of legitimacy? I mean, why was there not somebody who started a second, War of the Roses here?
Well, the relationship with Scotland had changed. It was better during Elizabeth's reign than it had been. Certainly during Henry VIII's reign, there were constant wars over the border and constantly that was going on. Interestingly, the same was true in Edward VI's time. As Scotland, and by Scotland, I'm really meaning Edinburgh and the seat of power in Edinburgh. This was not true of the Highlands, but in Edinburgh, where the power was residing, a shift in religion. And as the lords of the congregation became, we'll say, Protestant in the Scots religion, they were more amenable to a positive relationship with England. And so that idea, religion played a big factor in that. Mary, Queen of Scots, was kept in England, but under James, and he was raised as a Protestant. And so that idea of all the skirmishes and the arguments over religion, which had happened earlier in Elizabeth's reign, were being diminished some because the power players, even if not the populace, the power players were agreeing that James would be a good idea. The other thing that James did, and this was pretty savvy on his part, although it led to so much anger that the gunpowder plot came out of it. James sort of telegraphed the idea that as the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, that great Catholic queen, he would be much more sympathetic, much more tolerant of Catholics. And he made some overtures to Catholics in England who expected more from him in terms of recognition and less persecution. And they thought they'd be treated better than they had under Elizabeth. So even the Catholics were quite pleased initially as James came in. He was also married to Anne of Denmark, who was Catholic. And so they thought, okay, this is going to be great. Our lives are going to get so much better. That did not happen. So the Catholics, again, eventually in the Gunpowder Plot did rebel. But for a while, he had done a lot of smoothing of a lot of feathers and initially came in. And once he was crowned and established on the throne, he had 2 sons. So they were looking at a male succession years to come. And that was really important too. So there were more pros than cons with James, and people were willing overall to accept him fairly happily.
A smooth operator, that James the First.
He was. He did not continue to be so. He lost that popularity pretty quickly, but he came in really quite well.
Given her level of fame, both during her life and continuing today, there is a mountain of information to unpack about Elizabeth I and her status as the Virgin Queen. Carol Ann, help us cut through the clutter a little bit and share with us your favorite starting places for someone that's new to the life of Elizabeth I, that's new to this idea of her being a Virgin Queen. Where should they begin if they want to learn more?
Well, if you're new to the whole Tudor world, and kind of want to see maybe what's going on in the private areas, I think Tracy Borman's book, The Private Lives of the Tudors, gives you a really good overview. And that will be, that does give you some of Elizabeth and puts her in the context of her family. And I think it is important as you look at Elizabeth to understand she's operating as the final Tudor. She's the longest reigning Tudor. And all of that matters when you look at her. So that's one place I go. Of course, I can't help but recommend my book, Courting the Virgin Queen, if you really want to dig into that. Susan Doran also has, it's a little bit older book, but it's wonderful, Monarchy and Matrimony, that looks at Elizabeth and all of the goings on with all of these men, really gets into the story of the Archduke Charles. I mentioned him early on. He was sort of dismissed, but then Mary, Queen of Scots shows up and problems with Spain get bigger and they really need some help. So if she can marry Charles of Austria. So all these things are changing. It's very political. And then finally, History Hit has a really great overview online of 7 of Elizabeth's primary suitors. There were a lot more than that, but the ones that really make a difference, like I mentioned, Philip of Spain, Eric of Sweden, Archduke Charles, of course, Robert Dudley, but there's also her final suitor. She calls him her frog, the Duke of Anjou, Hercule Francois, the French prince who was the only one, I'll just mention, the only foreign suitor who comes to England to court her in person. And that really meant a lot to her. So that was a real possibility there at the end, too. So those sources can give you a way of getting in and really sort of chewing around in this. There's so much about her. And there are a lot of theories about why she didn't get married. Did she want to get married? Would she have gotten married if she had not been queen? All those things are still under debate. We really don't know.
I had no idea there were that many suitors. I mean, I knew there were several, but that's a whole bunch. What fun to explore. Oh my goodness. Well, we will place links to all of these resources in the show notes today. So if you're like me and you listen faster than you're able to write, don't worry about scribbling down the title and author. We have a complete list of these resources along with clickable links that take you right where you need to go, all in the show notes for today. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Carol Ann, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life. And that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those. And recently I was informed that on the original Desert Island Discs show where we take this question from, you were also offered a luxury item. So if you would like to select a luxury item to take with you on your island stay, you can select that as well.
Well, my luxury item would be a soft, down-filled, silk-enclosed pillow. I love a good pillow. That makes so much difference. So that is my luxury item. I do have a couple. It's hard for me to narrow it down to one book, but I will tell you there are a couple that just always bring me joy. And the first is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, so completely out of what we're talking about. But the second book I love and I listen to over and over on Audible is Judi Dench's fairly new release, Shakespeare, The Man Who Paid the Rent. And it is a dialogue between Judi Dench and a friend of hers. And she talks from the perspective of the characters she played in the plays and sort of goes over all of the Shakespeare plays she was in. And it is marvelous. And she's recorded some quotations and some speeches that she's given, and it just could not be more delightful. So I would have to have that with me. It's just brilliant.
What a fantastic look at a sparkling Shakespeare career. How much fun. I can imagine. That would be really awesome.
It is amazing.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've got two things I'm really excited about. One is I'm working on a program about leadership lessons from Juliet and other of Shakespeare's heroines. So I think, in our times today, we need good leadership. We need leadership from women. And we often associate leadership with power, with being the king or being the head of the army. And what I've found is you look at these heroines like Juliet, who we might dismiss as just this young thing who goes along. No.
I was going to mention that.
But Juliet, as a young woman, stands up to her father, stands up to Romeo when he says, what satisfaction, will you leave me so unsatisfied? And her response is, what satisfaction can you have tonight? If thy purpose be marriage, send word. I'm going to arrange for everything. I mean, she is running that show. She leads where she is. And that's what we find with Shakespeare's heroines is they lead where they are. They are managing their worlds. And I think there's some wonderful lessons there. So I'm really excited to dig into that and see how we get these leadership lessons from Juliet.
That sounds so exciting. I'm just selfishly, I hope that Margaret of Anjou makes an appearance because I think in terms of strong women in Shakespeare, she's my favorite. But I like Juliet for some of the reasons that you've outlined too. Although I'll say with that play, it hits you different when you're a mom of teenagers.
Yes.
And then you encounter that play. You see Juliet just a different shade,
Yes.
But yes. Well, we'll look forward to seeing your next project come to life. Carol Ann LLoyd, thank you so much for being here this week and sharing this history with us, helping us understand Elizabeth and her place in the life of William Shakespeare just that much better. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
If you would like more information on Carol Ann's work, along with a clickable list of all of the resources she's recommended for you today, along with a link to her British Royals, Rebels, and Romantics podcast, you can find all of these things in the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 369. Remember while you're there that if you want to see the bonus content, including primary documents, museum artifacts, and period paintings related to the reign of Elizabeth I and her status as the Virgin Queen, be sure to click the detailed show notes button on that show notes page where you can log in or join us if you're not already a supporter of the show, and all of the extras will expand right on the website. Again, that URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 369. That's CassidyCash.com/EP369. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.